Thanks for joining us today. I'm Kelly Marshall. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about workplace violence and some things that you should know. So before we get started, you have probably noticed you've all entered the webinar on mute. Your computer and your phone has been muted. We will take questions, however, during the webinar. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and enter any questions that might come up for you. We will take those and answer them as time allows at the end. Before we do that, I have a quick question for each one of you. So you should see this pop up on your screen. If you're able, you can go ahead and type in your short answer. Once I can see that at least most of you have had a chance to do that, we'll keep moving on. Maybe just a couple more seconds here. So if you haven't had a chance, you should have a little box that popped up in your screen to go ahead and type in. Thank you. So our objectives for today are listed here. We're going to talk a little bit about the increase in the trend of violence throughout different workplaces and across all industries, some strategies for preventing workplace violence, and in addition, some steps that you can take if you do have a violent incident that happens in your place of work. So let's start by talking about what workplace violence really is. OSHA defines workplace violence as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. So according to that definition, the National Safety Council tells us that workplace violence is the fifth leading cause of workplace deaths, and over 57,000 workplace injuries were caused by workplace violence in the years 2021 to 2022. In fact, as I mentioned, not only is workplace violence on the rise across every industry, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that around 800 workers die every year as a result of workplace violence. So there's a couple of different reasons or categories of workplace violence, the biggest of those being criminal intent. So this is the type of incident that happens when someone intends to commit a crime. In fact, about 85% of workplace violence injuries are due to some sort of a criminal act. So these are in places like public transportation, retail, liquor stores, convenience stores, and gas stations. I know we often think about workplace violence being things like healthcare and schools, but you can see how, especially with this criminal intent piece, we really throw in lots of other industries and people who are susceptible to these things happening at your own places of work. The next type of workplace violence incident is between a customer and a client. So these are things that happen during some sort of a routine job duty, things that we think of more commonly as law enforcement types of interactions, flight attendants, people working with the public, corrections officers, and teachers. The next type of violent incident is worker on worker or between some colleagues or former colleagues. This might happen when you have perhaps a disgruntled employee or a former employee, and the person committing the crime or the act of violence is maybe interacting with a current employee or a vendor or contractor or something of that nature. And finally, you have the personal relationship where a violent incident may happen, but it truly has nothing to do with perhaps what's going on at the workplace, except for the fact that you have an employee who happens to be at work when the violent incident occurs. So these are those personal relationships, more commonly domestic related and more commonly happening to female workers. So who's at greatest risk? Well, OSHA tells us it's these people who are working alone, people who are working, like we talked about with convenience stores and different types of money collectors, those who are working with unstable or volatile people, for example, healthcare or different sorts of public-facing employees, those who work in places where alcohol is sold or served, and those who are maybe working in or traveling through poorly lit stores or parking areas. So of course, you can also have the impact of the time of day and the location where people are working. For example, if they're working late at night or in areas that happen to just be higher crime areas. Other people who are at high risk are those who are exchanging money with the public. Even people like delivery drivers that maybe we don't always think about as being at risk for violence. Healthcare professionals, public service workers, customer service agents are a big one, and of course that law enforcement piece as well. So workplace violence impacts, of course, not just the individual who may experience an injury or an incident, but workplace violence impacts our organizational health as well. So in addition to the physical impact when someone experiences some sort of an injury or an incident, they may have something that may be major, something that may be minor. Of course, it can be as significant as causing a temporary or even a permanent type of disability related to the kind of injury that they sustain, and can be as serious as other health issues being caused, like heart disease, hypertension, and even death in some serious cases. Additionally, you have the psychological impacts to consider. These are the things that we don't always see that may not even have a relation to a physical incident, but things like post-traumatic stress that happen after an injury or an incident has occurred. The anxiety, the depression, the fear about going back into that same situation where an employee may have had an incident that had happened at work. They can also then start to experience those sleep disturbances, fatigue, just the general distraction from being able to do what they're used to doing at work because of the incident that's occurred. And that all leads to burnout as well. Like any other work-related injury, we have the financial impact to consider, both for the employee, but also for our organizations. So if you have an injured worker who's experiencing perhaps time away from work or other conditions that they need to treat for, you have the lost wages of that employee to consider. You have the potential that they may need to use some of their sick or their leave time, vacation time. You have the medical costs that are associated with treating that physical and or psychological injury. And then you have just simply that cost of absenteeism when you're working short or you don't have employees who are able to do the job that you've hired and been paying them to do. And finally, we have the social piece. So this is where we start to see truly that impact of all of the other people around us, where we have the disturbance in relationships. You have family and friends, coworkers that are impacted by that employee's change as a result of an incident. They start to withdraw from those around them, and they're simply trying to deal just with that interpersonal conflict that happens after they've had something that they're trying to get over, whether it be physical or psychological. Of course, all of these things added together impact our organizations and result in increased turnover, absenteeism, folks being late for work, folks not showing up for work, that overall reduced commitment to the organization and being able to provide that good customer service or patient care, or simply just showing up to do the job. So we'll shift just a little bit to talk about the two types of mental health work comp claims. And let me share with the caveat that this is very, very different based on the state and the jurisdiction in which you live and what kinds of workers' compensation compensability laws apply to you. So if you do have specific questions, I would encourage you to reach out after the webinar, and we can make sure that we get those answered with our claims team who has the expertise and experience in handling any kind of mental health considerations or concerns in the state where you live. The two different types of mental health claims are the physical mental and the mental mental. So the physical mental claim is a mental health condition that's been caused or linked to some sort of a physical injury. There's an actual physical injury that occurs, and as a result, there's a mental health condition, concern, injury that takes place. The mental mental claim is a mental health condition simply on its own. It may have been caused by work, but not necessarily by a physical injury. So these are the examples where we may have an employee who's not necessarily been physically involved or injured by a work-related violence incident, but maybe they witnessed a traumatic event or witnessed an act of violence, and as a result have some mental health concerns that have then led to difficulties with doing the work that they are supposed to be at work to do. Again, our claims team is specialized. They're very experienced at handling all of these claims for the jurisdiction where you live. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I know it's very different for all of us based on the state where we live. Our claims team responds to any kind of an incident, including those of workplace violence, as best they can in almost a similar way every time. The process starts with a complete investigation, and overall, we intend, especially with a claim like this, to handle those with empathy, to understand that the employee has gone through something very significant, and we want to make sure that we show empathy and that we're sensitive to what they may have gone through. We start by taking a recorded statement to understand what happened at the time of the incident. And that's where we gather all of that detailed information about the who, when, where, and what of how this injury or incident occurred. If available, we can take some witness statements and gather information from others who may have been there at the time of the incident. We also like to secure any kind of videos or photos that may be available, and sometimes that can be a time-sensitive issue. So we want to do those things right away. We'll also take a detailed medical history from the injured worker, and we may ask some questions of you as the employer about any kind of EAP program that you offer that can help support the injured worker at this point in time. So we're next going to talk a little bit about best practices. And this is specific to simply a workplace violence program and policy. So we'll talk through each one of these, some in more detail than others, and you'll get some additional information when we finish the webinar today that's available on the RES portal. In the meantime, I have one more question for you. So once again, you're going to see another question pop up on your screen. This is a yes/no question, so it doesn't require as much thought. You can each take a quick second to give me a yes/no about workplace violence policies where you are. One more quick second for those of you who are scrambling to try to get to a keyboard or keypad. All right, that ends your audience participation. So good job, everybody. So the first best practice that we'll talk a little bit about here is establishing a workplace violence policy. So that's where we always recommend that you start with getting a workplace violence program in place, is to have a policy. And of course, that can be starting with something very, very simple. If you don't have something or you don't know where to go, please reach out. The Society for Human Resources Management is always a good place to start and has lots of sample policy pieces if you're looking for something like that. Your workplace violence policy should really start by just identifying what constitutes a threat, like we talked about in the very beginning. That can be both verbal and nonverbal, and what that means for you and your organization. And of course, then your next step is to make sure that everybody knows that you have a policy and what the policy is, which leads to our next best practice. It's also important that you encourage your employees that they promptly report any kind of incident that they perceive to be workplace violence in accordance with what your policy has stated constitutes that threat. So they should know, like any other policy, how to report an incident, what to report, when, and to whom. And in this particular incident, it's also important that employees understand that they won't get in trouble for reporting something. So you want to make sure that if there are concerns or there are any kind of causes for concern among what may or may not be a threat, that they won't be reprimanded if they report something that then is investigated and deemed not to be a workplace violence threat. Next is to have a plan, and this is where we will spend a fair amount of time talking in more detail about what that really means. Lots of pieces will go into your plan. So to start with, it's important that you have an idea of what's already happened. What's out there? What are the hazards? What are the things that we should be concerned about? Starting with a worksite analysis. This should include being able to analyze and track any kind of workplace violence incidents that you may have had over the last couple of years if you have that kind of information. This could be things like trends in specific job titles or departments, different job tasks that may have been being completed at the time of an incident, different workstations, duty stations, or locations where you may have employees working, the frequency of any kind of incidents that may have occurred, different dates, whether it be days of the year, days of the week, times of the day, any other potential crimes that could have included violence that your business may have experienced. So shoplifting, for example, any other kinds of threats or harassment of your employees while they were on duty. Things like if there were firearms or any weapons that may have been used or carried at the time of the incident, and how many workers were on duty when something may have occurred, including whether or not, if there was an incident, if law enforcement was called and involved. Analyzing your workplace security might look different for different departments. So a different location, even if it's within the same facility, might have different concerns just based on the type of work that that particular department or employee is doing, whether or not they're internal or external facing, and what kinds of people they might be interacting with. You should also be looking at what your employees were doing both before and during any kind of incident of violence that you might uncover. In addition, you should be looking at if there were any preventative measures in place at that time, and if, just like with any other accidents or incidents, if those precautions were in place and being used at the time of the incident. The next piece of that plan for maintaining your security is looking at your hazard prevention and controls. So much like any other kind of hazard, we want to do our best to engineer out and simply get rid of those hazards from the very beginning. So if there's anything that we can do to remove a hazard entirely and engineer that out, that's the easiest place to start to maintain some control for avoiding a workplace security incident. These include things like checking your lighting, making sure that those things are functioning, your locks and security cameras are functioning and in good working order. In places where you may have employees who are using, have access to cash, you want to make sure that they're using drop safes or doing things like prohibiting transactions with large bills, or keeping a minimum amount of cash in the register that's actually easily accessible. Might also include things in that particular incident, or in the case of employees who are interacting regularly with the public, of using physical barriers or things like enclosures or different kinds of pass-through windows to limit that exposure. Include things like policies around when your doors are locked, or times that you may accept deliveries, open those doors and keep them unlocked for trash disposal, for example. You may also need to consider things like when employees are coming and going from the building, if they need to use a buddy system, if you have times or locations that have a higher concern of staff coming in and out on their own, maybe at times of the night when they might be at higher risk. You may also want to consider adding things like a security escort in some of those evening hours or poorly lit or more remote parking areas. You should also consider developing your emergency procedures to use in case you do have an incident. If you're somewhere that may have a risk for a robbery or a security breach, things like what happens next in calling the police, triggering some sort of an alarm system. If that's you, you should make sure that you have a liaison, you have some contact with your local police, so they have an understanding of what your facility looks like, what your business practices look like. They can then expedite their response and providing that assistance and investigation if you do have something that occurs where you're needing to call them in. You may also want to think about having a trained response team that can help respond to those emergencies. And then what happens with your management at the time of an emergency, and what kind of support do they provide to your staff? It's important to remind your employees as well that whenever we can, we want to make sure we're using the properly trained people to deal with those aggressive behaviors and to discourage them from doing those things themselves. In some instances, that might even mean that you should discourage your employees from wearing things that might put them at greater risk, though things like chains or necklaces that could become a strangulation hazard in times of a confrontational situation. Next in this plan is, of course, to provide some training and resources. So a good place to start is to simply include some kind of training for all of your employees. Everyone, regardless of what their job titles or duties are, should understand that workplace violence, again, is on the rise, and it should really just be expected, but we're going to do our best to try to avoid or mitigate it. And if and when it does happen, that they know how to respond. They should know what the hazards are specific to their job. So whether it's their job title, their location, or their department, their work site should have its own specific understanding of what is a hazard for those particular employees. They should know how to control for those different hazards. And again, we want to try to limit them from intervening in any of those kinds of altercations whenever that's possible. Other things for you to think about in this regard are specific topics that might be very unique to just the employee and the job that they're doing. So what are your operational procedures for cases, for example, where employees are those who are responsible for handling actual cash on the job? What are the security measures for them and the engineering controls that are in place based on the job duties that they're performing? Do they need to be someone who has that early recognition and understanding of any kind of escalating behavior that may become a concern for violence? And is that someone then who needs to be trained further on a behavioral strategy to provide some of that conflict resolution or management technique based on the job that they do? Everybody should know where and how to operate any kind of safety devices that you may have as a result of the hazards that you've identified in your workplace. And of course, the policies and procedures around reporting any kind of incident and obtaining care for themselves or for their colleagues if there is an incident that happens. One note I would also make here is that many of you may need to think a little bit differently about those employees that you have that go out into homes. So some that we don't always think about are delivery drivers, for example, who are frequently in and out and maintaining contact with lots of different people and environments throughout the day, and home health workers, just to name a couple of those. And finally, record keeping is another piece of this plan in maintaining your workplace security. This includes things, of course, like your OSHA log, medical reports of any kind of work-related injuries, supervisor statements, recorded documents about any injuries that have happened, documentation of any kind of safety meetings that you may have had, and topics that would include things like workplace violence, training, and mitigation. And of course, I have to remind you that any policy is only as good as it is being enforced and being reviewed. So make sure that's something that you put on your docket to be reviewed on an annual basis, just to ensure that nothing significant has changed. As with any good practice, it's important that you have someone that's responsible for this. So like you do for lots of other things, you want to make sure that you've identified a workplace champion or champions that can really be your point of contact for your workplace violence program. That should be the person or persons who are that advocate for part of this as your workplace culture and your environment of safety. They should be able to provide some of that insight and feedback, both up and down the ladder of communication, and help to create the group, the content, really that camaraderie around building a safety program and a culture around workplace safety and security. And last, it's important that we make sure that management has a commitment to this as well, and that it isn't simply just another policy or practice that we have written on paper, but that it's truly something that we all understand its importance and why it is that everybody's responsible for maintaining a safe work environment. Whenever you can, it's important to make sure you've got supervisors that are included in some of these roles of responsibility for managing your workplace violence program, and to be able to work collaboratively with any of those outside parties that you may need to have a vested interest in what's going on with the security in your workplace. So this might include, as I mentioned previously, local law enforcement, maybe a landlord, or even a security company that might be responsible for pieces of this, just to ensure that everybody's on the same page and we all have the same commitment to keeping your workplaces safe. So once again, that's just a list of your top 5 best practices. As I mentioned, we do have additional information on the RAS portal. So that will come to you when we finish the webinar with a reminder about how you find those different pieces and resources that are available for you. If you do have any questions, I would recommend that you reach out to me at any point in time, and we would be happy to make sure that you're getting what you need. So with that being said, we have just a couple of minutes for any questions that may have popped up.
We did have a question, Kelly. Will RAS have some resources or best practices the employer can use for training?
We do have some best practices and resources. Again, those are on the RAS portal, and you will get those with a follow-up after the webinar has been completed. We have things as simple as just some tip sheets and best practices that can help if you're looking to get a workplace violence policy established. And otherwise, it can help to supplement any kind of existing policy that you already have in place. So safety posters and things like that that you may use simply just around your work site, or to be able to include to share with your employees to supplement your program. I did have a question as well as if the slides will be available, and you will receive a link not only to the resources that I mentioned, but it will have the recorded webinar available as well. So if you missed part of it, or if you have colleagues that you wish to share this with, that will come out as well, and you have access to all of those slides. We're coming right up on your end time here, so I just wanted to say thank you again for joining me today. Please take the time to provide some feedback on any topics that you would like to see in future webinar events. You will have a survey link that pops up immediately as soon as we finish the webinar here. You'll also receive that follow-up email with the information on workplace violence prevention resources. And I want to remind you that we will be hosting our next in the Step Up webinar series in December. Documenting the details, OSHA record keeping made easy. So look for that reminder coming soon as well. Thanks again for joining us and for stepping up to keep your workplaces safe. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.